Welcome to Spybrary, by Spy fans, for Spy fans, with your host, Spywright's Jeff Quest.
Hi, I'm Jeff, and I'll be your host today. I'm pleased to be joined on this episode by Benjamin Cunningham. Cunningham was a correspondent for The Economist for nearly a decade, and prior to that worked as editor-in-chief of the Prague Post, and has contributed articles to numerous other international publications. He is also the author of the recent book, The Liar: How a Double Agent in the CIA Became the Cold War's Last Honest Man. The Liar follows Karel Koecher, who was sent by the Czechoslovakia spy agency in the late 60s to the U.S. and managed to get a job working for the CIA. It's a wild story of Eastern Bloc politics, KGB spies, how hard it is to make it in academia, and literally swinging 70s New York City. It's a wild story, and I can't wait to talk about it. Ben, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks a lot for having me. Really happy to join you.
So before we get into this story, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, particularly how you ended up in the Czech Republic. And I'm assuming that's how you stumbled onto this story.
Yeah, I mean, it's by accident, really. My whole life is a bit of an accident, you know. I grew up in Michigan, and after college, I was working at some newspapers there. I worked in Oakland Press, the Saginaw News, the Grand Rapids Press, so sort of mid-sized cities in Michigan. More or less, at some point, I just sort of, I was 25, 26, and I sort of was bored. I sort of was like, am I, going to the next city council meeting again, this kind of thing. So I had always wanted to write about sort of international, my dream was foreign correspondent type work. So I went and got a master's degree in international relations, and I thought it was a good idea to study international relations internationally. So I went and studied in the Netherlands. I studied at the University of Amsterdam. And then from there, I sort of was in Europe, kind of freelancing, kind of bouncing around a bit, and I stumbled on this job. I actually applied once for a job at the Prague Post, didn't get it. About a year later, another opening came up, and I got a job there, and then I sort of kind of advanced through the chain of command there. I ended up getting married. My wife is from Slovakia, so kind of ended up staying there longer than I ever planned, and then kind of transitioned over to work with The Economist. So all in all, I was a little over 10 years living in Prague, step by step, waded deeper into the history and then, politics. And then while there, kind of got wind of this, pieces of this story, kind of the urban legend version of this story of Karel Koecher and his wife, Hanna. I was a journalist in Prague, so kind of had some networking done. Couple degrees of separation, I was able to sort of eventually find Karel and Hanna living outside of Prague in this village, and sort of just kind of started going out and meeting with them and talking. And so, kind of snowballed from there.
Well, so our main character is Karel, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about him and how he ended up being recruited as a spy.
When I was setting out to write the book, you kind of have to think of what your book is going to be like, that it's, maybe there's a lot of spy books, there's a lot of history books, what is going to distinguish yours? And so one thing that I was really interested in was this character, the person. What kind of psychology is a person who gets into espionage? Where are they coming from? And so he was born in 1934 in Bratislava, which is now the capital of Slovakia, but was then Czechoslovakia. His mother was Jewish. His father was postal worker. His father had been a soldier for the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. 1934 in that part of the world is not, things kind of start getting dicey, to say the least. And Karel's mother was Jewish. They eventually, when he's 3 or 4 years old, they moved to Prague, thinking that Prague is more cosmopolitan than Bratislava, but thinking Jews would be more accepted in Prague, which had been the case up until that time, but it was obviously a difficult 1937, 38, 39. In Central Europe, you had the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, Munich Agreement, all these sort of things. He grew up in tense circumstances and then lived through the war. After the war, Czechoslovakia is sort of democratic for a couple of years, but in 1948, there's sort of the communist takeover. The 1950s is sort of high Stalinism type atmosphere in Czechoslovakia that he's sort of coming up in, coming of age in. So the setting he's in is less than ideal. And he's an ambitious, kind of hyper-intelligent guy. And so, I think a lot about time and circumstance of, where I was born in the United States in the 80s. Pretty fortunate in the grand sweep of history to have, been born in that time and place. And so I think of Karel as this guy that in another time and place, intelligent, ambitious, like those sorts of characteristics would have been rewarded. If you're born in the 70s and in Silicon Valley, those are good characteristics to have. Being born in the 30s in Central Europe, you're kind of walking into a whirlwind. Personal ambition is, when the communists take over, is sort of, room for suspicion. He's an individual, so he doesn't kind of fit in. He doesn't just follow rules. And so he's in trouble all the time a little bit, at home, at school, run-ins with the police. At some point, he sort of takes on this persona of, what do I have to lose? Maybe if I get involved with the spy agency and get sent abroad, it can't be any worse than what I'm doing right now. So it kind of throw caution to the wind kind of attitude. And, so all of those building blocks that of his personality and the circumstance and things like that, those are things I was really trying to think a lot about. And I think it does. It sort of builds on each other. And that's, when ultimately my question, when I'm kind of trying to examine this guy is, what kind of lunatic kind of takes these risks, right? What kind of person can live? The book's called The Liar. What kind of person can live for 20 consecutive years in a foreign country, basically lying to everyone? I mean, not just lying to people professionally, but lying to your next door neighbor, whatever. Someone comes over to your house for dinner, you're kind of, putting up a facade all 24 hours a day for 20 years. And so, kind of going backwards and then kind of taking that trip with him through there, I at least try to a little bit of an amateur Freudian sort of, thing to kind of see where it's all coming from. And there's a lot there, I hope that I was able to sort of touch on some of the things. I'm no psychologist, professionally or anything, but there are some clear sort of episodes that that I think I try to highlight, are kind of flashpoints or something like that kind of hopefully sort of give a little insight into the psychology of a guy like this. Most of the people I dealt with this book were hard to trust, not even necessarily because they were intentionally misleading you, you know what I mean? But it's like sometimes you're talking to somebody about something that happened 40 years before. Even in this case, I talked to, for example, FBI agents that were eventually involved in sort of monitoring and tracking the Koechers, and they have a kind of a rose-colored view of what they were up to in the 70s and the 80s. And so long story short, he is slippery. He is difficult to sort of get pinned down. But that was a bigger problem, in general, both because people kind of have, something of an agenda over something like the Cold War. And then also because a lot of these people are older and these things happened a long time ago. So even the best, their best effort to be accurate is likely not, quite getting there.
So I was hoping you could maybe set up the geopolitical frame of when Karel is going to the U.S. and give us a little sense of what's going on there, because he heads there just ahead of the Prague Spring. He's kind of, I think, ideological fluid in his political allegiances. Although the Russians are invading later, he seems less than worried about it. So I maybe kind of set up where are we at politically?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of things that are, interesting when you kind of get into this world is, there's a tendency to think of the sort of the Eastern Bloc as every country being exactly the same. And so, all those countries were communist, all those countries were sort of, at the beck and hand of Moscow to some degree. But there's also sort of these domestic sort of ebbs and flows and how harsh the regime is in Hungary versus Poland versus Czechoslovakia at any given time. And so in most places in the 50s, there's kind of this heavy-handed, really harsh brand of communism that sort of, as the system sort of takes root, that's when you have your show trials and things like that. In Czechoslovakia by the 60s, so then there's also, a revolution in Hungary in the 50s that the Soviets come in and, stamp out. In Czechoslovakia, there's this sort of brief sort of period where things are slightly liberalizing and people actually can travel freely. The biggest barrier to, going to the West isn't proverbial Iron Curtain or anything like that. It's just money. You don't have enough. They limit how much money you're allowed to take out of the country. People in Czechoslovakia were poorer than people in, say, West Germany. So there was these informal restrictions that limited travel. So things are kind of bubbling under the surface, loosening up a little bit as Karel leaves. But his experience he leaves in 1965, but his experience up to that point is, hardline kind of Stalinist atmosphere in Czechoslovakia. He gets to the States, and that sort of liberalization sort of flowers. It's the Prague Spring. I'm trying to use all my metaphors at once here. The Czechoslovakia does become more liberal. This guy, Alexander Dubček, takes over, kind of displaces the previous party chief, has designs on actually having, transitioning towards open elections in 10 years, is, loosening the reins on censorship in the media, things like that. And most of the other sort of Eastern Bloc countries are kind of looking on in horror, and Moscow in particular is looking on in horror. So that eventually, prompts this crackdown in August 1968, where not just the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union with many of the other Warsaw Pact allies invades Czechoslovakia. And so Karel has this mixed, as you note, he kind of has this fluid sort of political allegiances. And so he also has some kind of respect for the Soviets in their sort of professionalism in how they do spying, and lacks respect for his own sort of supervisors in the Czechoslovak intelligence services, the STB. So he's kind of, even in this sense, a bit torn, between two camps. He kind of is thirsty for recognition from Moscow and from, who he views as the professional sort of spy service. He wants them to recognize his skills, his competence. And at the same time, he's sort of disgusted by the fact that they are invading his native country. So I guess that's sort of one of the many sort of tugs of war that are going on in his head, in terms of values and allegiances and things like that. And I guess, ultimately the conclusion, that one ends up drawing throughout the book is mostly he's loyal to himself. What comes across though is hopefully, or what I tried to at least try to understand why a personality develops in that way. And actually what I not so much conclude, but what I think the story shows is people really didn't care about him. His parents didn't care much about him when he was a kid. I think the Czechoslovak intelligence services sent him to the United States kind of on a whim, kind of saying, let's see if this guy can make something happen, penetrate the CIA. And if he gets caught, no big loss on our side. And so I kind of have a sympathy at some point for his sort of self-preservation instincts, right? Over loyalty towards an ideological or national cause. But I think, his interaction with the politics of the time are sort of what also sort of expresses this sort of survival instinct, but also moral fluidity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The STB sends him there, but they don't really give him any sort of plan or have any idea of what he's supposed to do or how he's supposed to do it, right? It's really kind of the JV squad of spy agencies, it felt like.
Absolutely. And so, one big part of the book, and we were just talking before about sort of, being able to trust what he says, or he's kind of a slippery character when you're interviewing him. And a big backbone foundational part of the research of the book were these files, these declassified STB files. And so, two points on that, to go back to the, trusting him or being able to believe what he says, it was really useful, obviously, to have this sort of outside source to kind of be able to check against what he was saying or his own recollections or other people's recollections. And it's not so much that I 100% believe everything that's in those files as fact, but at the same time, somebody who was writing a document in 1974 for the STB was not writing that document with the idea that I was going to be reading it, 40, 50 years later, and they were trying to mislead me. So in some ways, it is more reliable than eyewitness testimony. I guess the other side, to catch up on the question we're talking about now, the JV squad sort of element of things, you go through all these documents and you are sort of, in some ways, a lot of them are super monotonous, right? They're just sort of bureaucratic pages of documents, expense reports for coffee, literally, stuff like that. People analyzing what's going on, but you can really see they're cutting and pasting what somebody else has analyzed a couple of years before, almost as if they just need to turn in a report. Their assignment is to file a report. So they're going to file a report, and, it's Friday at 4:00. I'll cut and paste this and get home for the weekend kind of vibe to it, That really does come across in when you go through this stuff in volume, this sort of half-ass nature of it really does come through, and that's obviously a little bit tragicomic, and it's also, I guess a little bit dangerous too. I mean, people are making these sort of consequential geopolitical decisions based on, at minimum, flawed, half-baked intelligence. In the end, it's also a little bit discouraging. As you say, I think, the KGB, if we went through the KGB or the CIA files, I think they'd be slightly more professional. But at the same time, there are massive bureaucracies, the incentives in a system, in particular the KGB, right, to issue a real, if someone asks you to file a report, your incentive to really put hardcore analysis in there and give your opinion is pretty low. Even if you do a great job and you analyze the situation perfectly, in 3 years, the political winds shift a little bit, and your analysis from what was perfect 3 years earlier could be, treason. You know what I'm saying? So it's this convoluted sort of thing where you're just sort of like, the system is inherently flawed, right? I mean, the mechanisms in place are just no way to run the world.
Yeah, I liked the way that you kind of reference how often these folks are hedging their bets when they're writing these reports. They don't want to go all in. They're kind of skirt the edges and then kind of step back.
Right.
And I think that part of that, though, too, is after the invasion of Prague, everybody turns over, right? Because all of the old people, let's out with the old, in with the new. And then things kind of change again. And so, you just get the sense that nobody ever wants to take a stand, ever.
Yeah, the incentives are not in favor of, you can have a good couple of years if you take a stand, but the winds shift the other way and and the consequences are severe. You're talking about, they're not so much executing people in the late 60s and 70s, but you're talking about, your children are not going to college. You are now sweeping the floor in a factory, even though you're a medical doctor, like this kind of stuff. Like, your life takes a serious turn for the worse if you're on the sort of the wrong side of the line at any given time.
So let's get back to Karel, because he's in the U.S. now. How does he make his way as a spy? Like, what is his plan? What does he come up with?
So his plan actually, it takes a few years, but it works pretty well. His plan, and I think he just wanted to do this. He goes to Columbia University and he gets a PhD. And the idea is these are the kinds of places that the American intelligence services are recruiting people from. People with language skills at Ivy League institutions. So his plan, so much as there is one, is I'm going to hang around at Ivy League institutions. I'm going to be a fervent anti-communist. Tell everyone I can find that I'm an anti-communist. Put my Russian, Czech, Slovak, German language skills on display, and see if I can get myself a job in American intelligence. And literally at some point he just applies for a job and he gets the job. He passes a lie detector test to get the job. There's some intrigue around how exactly that happened. Eventually he gets a job in a section where he is listening to wiretaps on Soviet embassies in Latin America. And his job is to listen to these wiretaps, flag the ones that are relevant, translate them so that people in the CIA can make use of them. The idea is that the CIA is looking for Soviet diplomats in Latin America that they can flip, that they can use as spies to work for the CIA. And so he's sort of at the crossroads. He's not the guy recruiting them, but he's sort of in that assembly line process at a critical juncture of the CIA trying to recruit and flip Soviet diplomats in Latin America. And it's a pretty interesting sort of geopolitical time in Latin America, the 60s, the 70s, into the early 70s. So Karel starts his job at the CIA in 1973. That's the year where there's a coup in Chile. They overthrow Salvador Allende. Pinochet takes over. The CIA is not directly involved in that, but not uninvolved either. So Latin America has sort of emerged as this sort of peripheral front, but a front in the Cold War. The United States starts sort of backing, right-wing military juntas in Argentina and Brazil and places like that. And so he's sort of somewhere in that sort of machinery, the early days of those policies.
Sure. Well, and he's able to give them actionable intelligence as far as, these are the places that the CIA has bugged. these are the diplomats they're listening into. These are the people they may be trying to recruit, right? And so if this gets back to the KGB, and that's when they really take a stronger interest in him, right? Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. He has a line somewhere that he even says himself. Can't remember the exact quote from him, but it's in the book. It's like, it's sort of like playing cards. You have cards. You're kind of figuring it out as you go along. His role, I'm talking about now. You have cards, you hold cards, you play cards, and what he's doing in this case is sort of, in terms of the double agent part of fulfilling his role as a double agent. He's working in the CIA. He's taking that information he has and feeding it back to the Eastern Bloc, and that does get to Moscow, and then you're exactly right. That's when Moscow kind of takes notice. They sort of say, "Whoa, okay, first of all, who's this guy that we have in the CIA? We didn't, we haven't been able to do that." And then he's actually given them pieces of information that are useful. And you're exactly right. This embassy has a bug on the phone. Even outside of his sphere of expertise, Latin America, he picks up. It's been a while since the exact details, but I think he gets wind of some information about, maybe it's the Aeroflot office, the airline in Tehran, Iran is bugged. There's some stuff in Lebanon that he gets wind. So it's just kind of he's bumping up against these pieces of information that he's able to feed back, and the Soviets really start to take notice of him.
Well, and that's when, throughout this, the underlying thing is that money is so important to him, and getting money, because in my mind, he's taking these risks. He feels like he's taking these risks. And at the same time, he's not respected, because I think that's another thing that comes through is he really, more than anything, wants to be respected, because he is very smart, but he wants other people to know it. At least that's the way I took it.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah.
And one of the ways that you do that is you get more money, right? And so as he does start to get this, the KGB does kind of cough up more cash, right?
Yeah, I think almost everything has a couple layers to it. And even the money thing, I think there's this sort of psychological desire for recognition that's runs throughout the book. If I can say, I'm not going to, tell the exact ending, but he never really gets it. I mean, it's sort of at every turn, he's looking for somebody to recognize how valuable he is, how smart he is, how whatever. And no one ever quite is willing to do that. The other side is, I think and this gets into sort of the personal life thing, kind of decadence that him and his wife, Hannah, sort of, wade into. It's a lot more fun to have a lot of money than it is to be struggling, And once they get a taste of it, and actually what they do is they start, they're hanging out with wealthier people in Manhattan by the mid to later 70s. And, you're talking about people of like multi-generational wealth. The Koecher's apartment was between Park Avenue and, it's like 2 blocks from Central Park, 1 block from Park Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And so their neighbors are, Anne Bancroft lives in their building, Mrs. Robinson, right? And her husband, Mel Brooks. There's this sort of psychological need for recognition. And then there's just, greed's not quite the word, but let's say healthy taste for
the finer things in life.
Yes. Yeah, sure. Exactly. There you go.
That time frame, they want to live it up. I mean, it does, that's like you think of all of those movies of the 70s, right? And that's kind of the vibe that you get. They're living, want to live on the high life, and when you think of where they're coming from, that's not surprising when you see that around you, that would be, something that you'd want to do. But it also, for him as a spy, it is to his advantage to be in that kind of milieu, right?
For sure. I mean, you're rubbing shoulders with elites is how you get information. Elites are the people that are populating government and, high levels of the intelligence services and things like that. So, how do you get those people to trust you? You kind of have to be, one of them. I think there's this other element, again, and you can't, some of this is speculative, but once you kind of talk to these people long enough and you kind of try to put yourself in their shoes, I mean, this is a stressful existence, right? To be living this lie all the time. And so I think there is a bit of, I deserve this, I'm risking my life. I'm doing all these things. So I deserve, 1, money, and 2, I deserve to be able to kick back and relax on the weekends and have a good time. And I think and also I think it's a way to blow off steam, and it's not maybe the way that the average person chooses to, I'm talking about now they get involved in this sort of swinger scene, kind of partying, kind of elite partying. There's sort of cocaine is kind of being thrown around in a way that's a little bit, it's still not a super prevalent drug, mainstream drug in the 70s. It's sort of becoming that. But they're sort of, riding the initial wave of cocaine kind of being a party drug in the U.S. And so I think there is this sense too that when your life is this pressure cooker, it seems unlikely that you're just going to take up golf on the weekend. You know what I mean? It's understandable that these things kind of do seem like they match. You know, when you're living at that high speed all the time, what would you do in your free time but continue to live at that high speed kind of thing?
Yeah. You touch on them getting involved in the swinger scene, and like they downplay it a little bit, but because it got overblown, it sounds like in the press, but it was a significant part of their life in that time when they were in New York doing this, right?
Absolutely. So that's, I guess, and then for me, in handling that in the book was an interesting sort of juggling act, right? Because I think so far as there been sort of anything circulating in public about them, it was almost a caricature that sort of focused exclusively on sort of the swinging spies and this sort of, partying and stuff like that. And I do think for the most part, most of that is that sort of, so far as it's circulated in the public sphere or in the press, later on when they sort of run into some legal troubles and things like that, I think it is sensationalized, but it's not irrelevant either. And so kind of balancing those two things, not shying away, it's a significant part of their life. It says something about their personality. It says something about it says something about the times and the place that they were living in. But I also was wary of sort of, it can come off as a mockery, these buffoons who were sex crazed buffoons that are just, silly 70s kind of silliness that everyone kind of makes a joke about in general. And so displaying that as sort of a significant part of their personality, which it was, and which they engaged in these sorts of practices for more than, a decade, 15 years. It was clearly a part of their social existence. And at the same time, I think it was, somewhat separate from the job. And there's some efforts in the popular press, as I said, around in the 80s when they kind of run into legal troubles, to kind of link those two things. It would make for a great story if they were coaxing national intelligence secrets out of people in a back bedroom, you know what I mean, or something like that. But they're separate parts of their life. They sort of intertwine a little bit. But I don't think, for example, in the Czechoslovak files, this is not mentioned one time. There's not a single mention at all of their sort of swinging and things like that. And that alone sort of leads you to conclude that was not, integral to the intelligence gathering practices.
Yeah, and I mean, you do get a nice blurb from Joe Weisberg, the creator of The Americans, which kind of plays into that kind of using, sexpionage and stuff. But it doesn't sound like that was the case here. But it does play into the relationship between Karel and his wife Hannah, because she is fully aware of what he's doing and what he's up to, and she actually is actively involved in it as well. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about their relationship and how that worked.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting, more than a subplot, but part of the plot, part of the major plot, their sort of life together, and they're still married now. And I guess I would say this too up front, probably my biggest regret is that I wasn't allowed to get Hannah to talk to me more. I would have liked to had a lot more in the book. There's as much as I could possibly put in there about her feelings on things, but she is much less excited to sort of relive these memories of the past. And frankly, I'm not sure she cared for me that much. She didn't trust me. I had some interviews with her and I was in their home and things like that. And, but she trusted me less than Karel did. I think her position as a woman made her less. She's sort of been painted as this sex object over the years. That makes her a little bit wary of opening up. And I just think she's a shyer person. To their relationship. So, she's about 10 years younger than Karel. And so when she moves to the States, she's 19 years old. So she's a young woman. She's pretty naive. She kind of grew up in this. Her father was basically a real communist, kind of a bureaucrat. Uneducated kind of guy that joined the party and got ahead and eventually becomes sort of a bureaucrat in the party and is a manager of like a warehouse switchboard, which is sort of a plum job, where you don't have to do much that you get if you're a communist loyalist. Her family is loyal communists, so she's actually a pretty good partner in this venture. She gets a job working in the diamond industry in Manhattan, which, she kind of gets it by accident, and it kind of really adds to the sort of overall sexiness of the story. It's not like some sort of part of a wider plan. It then, though, allows her in some ways to be sort of traveling internationally for work and therefore, helping to be a messenger in some of the espionage as well. There's tension that kind of emerges in their marriage. It's a high pressure situation. They get involved in this swinging party scene. They're both involved in that. I have to imagine that puts a strain on a marriage, sort of having multiple partners. And I think she's in the end pretty kind of she has simple motives. She wants to have kids. They never have kids. She misses her parents, her brother and sister. So there's sort of these human sort of elements of their relationship that sort of are running throughout that are interesting. And I guess it's an interesting thing that they sort of, it's clear a lot of the time that there's some, and this does occur in the STB reports, there's talk about marital tensions, there's things like that. People are unhappy. She sometimes writes letters home to her parents that get intercepted. So those are sort of in the files. And she often talks about how much pressure Karel's under and how, he's not happy with her because she doesn't cook good dinners, things like this, sort of really personal stuff. Yeah, it's a whole part of the story. And I guess that's the human element, that these are real people. These are things that there are books that do it, I suppose. But most spy books, most history books that I come across don't have that sort of flavor for the character. In the end, these are human beings put in this circumstance. And as best I could, I was trying to sort of capture that if possible.
Well, Karel, it seems like a very smart person. I'd say Hannah was the more like common sense. It seemed like she really knew when to step back and when to keep things at arm's length a little more than he did, and had a little bit more, I guess, just kind of common sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think level-headed. Karel has a big ego. And you sort of need to have a big ego to do these things, I think. She doesn't have that much of a big ego. And I think she also, her upbringing is she comes from small C conservative, so conservative for 60s, 50s and 60s Czechoslovakia, sort of establishment family. And so she's not as educated as Karel. She's younger when she kind of wades into this deep end of geopolitics. She lives more cautiously, I would say, and maybe there's a women element there too. I think a female element there too of being a little bit more humble, and I think also, again, this idea of the times. I mean, I think you grow up in the 1950s in Czechoslovakia, women had a certain role in society, and even in the 60s in the United States, we're starting to see the 60s and 70s in the United States. We're starting to see the sort of liberation of women, but it's still fairly, traditional society. People are, getting married when they're young. They're having 2.5 children. Men are predominantly working, these things like this. So a lot of this also kind of just, she plays that, the swinging kind of runs against that, but she kind of fits into a traditional place and is okay with that. And Karel does not fit in. He's a square peg in every hole. You know what I mean? In every round hole.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'm not going to go to the very, very end, but I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that they end up getting caught.
Right.
And this is where she really shines, because I think she's in that situation is kind of the hero. Karel picks a kind of, I don't know, you've looked at this more. He seemed like a terrible lawyer.
Yeah.
And his wife picked a great one.
Yeah.
And she locks herself down and is like the reason that they kind of make it through. And I just wanted to get your kind of take on that.
Yeah, I think they get, Karel gets caught. Karel's the one that's, committing the most serious crimes. He's the real spy. She is collaborating with him, working with him. So, she's implicated, but she is not strictly an employee of the Czechoslovak STB. Karel is. He's caught. He kind of gets into this. I don't want to go too deep because there's some interesting twists and turns. He's being prosecuted actually by Rudy Giuliani for espionage. He sort of cops to the fact, Karel, now, that he's a spy in what he thinks is in exchange for sort of an immunity deal. That deal is kind of, the Justice Department kind of pulls that deal off the table and then are not sort of able to use the evidence that he has given them in a trial. And so he's stuck sort of in limbo and he's in prison for a while. The Justice Department then tries to sort of, put the squeeze on Hannah to get her to be the witness that sort of, gives up the goods that they can use to prosecute Karel. And she doesn't. And they put her in jail for a while. She appeals and she gets out. Her case actually goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I spoke, I think it's in the book, but I spoke with her. She is a lawyer from the ACLU that defends her at the Supreme Court. He is a judge. I think he's retired now, but he was a federal judge later on, a professor at Columbia, real interesting guy. Lynch is his last name. And he actually argues the case before the Supreme Court. Before the Supreme Court rules on this case, a deal is made that they're traded for Anatoly Sharansky, Nathan Sharansky, a Soviet dissident. So she is, you're right. She, has nerves of steel at this point. She just refuses to talk. The Justice Department puts a lot of pressure on her. She doesn't budge. And in the end, that makes it very difficult to prosecute Karel. And ultimately is sort of her resistance and her intransigence causes discomfort and delays this process enough that the Justice Department has to kind of throw up their hands and the U.S. government has to just sort of let them go because they can't make a case.
Yeah, it's a great story. Really fascinating stuff. And I guess what would you say is the impact of this spy story? What is the takeaway that you had from doing all this research, learning about these two people and what they did? What was your hope for folks walking away from this?
Yeah, I guess for me, there's a couple of goals. One was I saw this really unique opportunity to really, I don't want to say paint characters because it sounds like I'm make them up. Detail the characters of people that are in this situation. I was fortunate that I was able to interview them, and then the files that I had were 20, through 20,000 something pages, and there's just this color and detail that is rare. And so these were real people. It's a nonfiction story, but in some ways I was hopeful that I could both probe the psychology and sort of also have sort of scenes, real set piece scenes that really happen. That's unusual for nonfiction. The material lent itself to that. So that's one thing, the storytelling element that I think hopefully was unusual or sets it apart from some other books that I've read. Parallel to that, the ability to sort of really see the inner workings of that institution, the STB. Again, going through all those files, and I think I said it earlier. Some of these things, the bureaucracy of a system like that, and it was really this sort of like this window into an institution that was making, having sort of geopolitical impact in this sort of time period, the Cold War, that we all sort of mythologize for good and bad. And you were able to sort of like, see how the sausage was being made, if that makes sense. And it wasn't that pretty, is what I found, right? No one thought it was pretty, but you were actually able to see, some details that were unique. And then I guess the third thing for me is he's not the most important spy ever. I think the subtitle of the book, How a Double Agent in the CIA Became the Cold War's Last Honest Man, my argument to the publisher as to why this was a book that people should care about is, and this is the play on words with honest too, I think his character portrays some truths about the Cold War. All these sort of incentives in the espionage system that sort of point the wrong way. We were talking about this with the reports and so intelligence that is not too intelligent, right? That's what the system is encouraging. And therefore, then people are making decisions about millions of people's lives based on half-baked sort of stuff. And so he was kind of this, for lack of a better term, he's a little bit of this kind of like a Forrest Gump type of a character that sort of is a vehicle that sort of puts you in these times and places in history, right? Forrest Gump always sort of ends up in the room or ends up, at the crossroads of history. And this guy kind of does that. He's not the most important spy ever, but in some ways, my argument is that his story tells some truths and gives some insights about the Cold War that might not otherwise be told, right? By this focus on sort of maybe not the most consequential character, but a character that sort of is, at these unique intersections, right? And actually, I think, the vast majority, you read stories about heroes and the most consequential spy, and those stories should be written and read, and I read those too. Those people are exceptions. That's why they're exceptional, right? And so in some ways, the average Joe spy, he's not quite the average Joe spy either, but there's some insight into sort of, the grittiness, I'm hopeful. This is how it was on the ground to some degree.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I always find fascinating about spies, right, is that one person's traitor is another person's hero, right?
Right.
That like it depends on your perspective of what country you're in as far
Right.
as how you're going to look at these people. And that's something I appreciated about this book, is that it kind of showed that this is just a person. And I think he isn't some sort of hugely ideological spy.
Right.
I think helps kind of humanize that whole story in a
Yeah.
way that I think you don't see in some of these other ones.
I mean, ultimately, if I were to, underline what really drove me, it was the story of the people. You know what I mean? Because of the material I had, because of some of the access I had, it was this chance. I mean, it's a nonfiction book, but I thought it could have some of the truthful, fact-based color of a fictional story. You can make up characters that have certain personality characteristics. And I actually was able to sort of take sort of psychological profiling and stuff like that the STV did, and combine that with my own sort of experience and actually give this character those characteristics and have it be truthful. Hopefully that was the goal. And so a story of people during the Cold War, unusual people and unusual circumstances. And by just following them, hopefully we get a unique perspective on something that maybe we already thought we had our ideas made up about.
Yeah. Well, I did want to push back on one thing that you kind of bring up
Sure.
at the end.
Sure.
So you talk about how, the most common interpretations of the Cold War is, the U.S. as the hero, the Soviet Union as the villain, and the Soviet Union especially as the inept. They can't get their act together, and yet they're also this, evil villain that's ready to destroy the world.
Right.
You say the same buffoons that couldn't figure out how to manufacture shoes in children's sizes almost talk your grandmother into betraying her country.
Right.
And, I guess for me, if the past few years have taught me anything, is that you can be completely inept and also
dangerous. Right? Yeah.
So I guess, I think I can have that little bit of a cognitive dissonance in my mind. I'm not sure when you finally finalize this manuscript, but if your perspective on that, if you could expand on that a little bit, maybe.
Yeah. So I think, I don't disagree. I certainly agree with your analysis of of contemporary events there. I would say, I guess my argument is, if I could take it one step further, I don't know if I think that both of those things are true, right? That they were comically inept and, right? I think that's the narrative that I think is inaccurate. So let me take two steps back. I am, first of all, grateful to have been born in the United States in 1980 instead of the Soviet Union. You know what I mean? My loyalties are both my biases and my analytical approach to where I would want to live is clearly to one side for sure, personally. But communism, it had in the early 20th century, especially in the 30s and the 40s, and especially in sort of the developing world, there was actual appeal to it, right? There are ideas there that people were attracted by. And there are times during the Soviet Union's evolution where they actually have a pretty good couple of years sort of, industrializing and things like that. And now, obviously, there's a lot of human cost to some of those steps they take. So I think the effort to paint them as comically inept is actually to not be willing to examine some of the things that were successful in a communist system. Now, I think the communist system is inherently flawed. I think the second thing I would say is I'm more worried about that lesson being the lesson of they're comically inept, and therefore also the United States triumph in the Cold War is proof that our system was superior. And I guess this connects to what I was saying. If they were comically inept, then our system beat an inept system, right? If our system beat a legitimate system, and therefore our system is truly superior, there's still there are merits to that, some underlying merits to that system. And my fear, in terms of sort of learning from history, is the lesson we've learned is there's nothing worth examining why sort of communism had some appeal. There's nothing redeemable about sort of, I don't know, state intervention in the economy or whatever it is. And I think that has been a conclusion. That's sort of since the 80s, the Western Europe and the United States has sort of doubled down on, privatization, deregulation, these sorts of things. And I think caused a lot of the sort of strife that we are undergoing now, it's almost like learning your own lesson too well is, I guess, my fear, right? And therefore not examining your own flaws enough. And I think I'm sort of stumbling over my words here. I think the example I draw as well in the conclusion is a football team. You win a football game, and your tendency is to not examine. You don't review the game tape, right? You won the game. Game over. We won the game, right? And so you lose the game, and you say, what did we do wrong? What did we do right? What do we need to improve on? And my sense is that the United States, the conclusion, the overarching conclusion, no conspiracy, but the prevailing narrative is we won the football game. So we're just going to do exactly what we did to win that football game forever. And I think that has been the sort of what's played out over the last 35 years to some degree. And I think it is what's sort of led to some of the sort of structural weaknesses of and geopolitical weaknesses or mistakes of the United States over the last few decades. It was a long-winded answer. I hope that was clear, though.
No, thank you. Okay, so to wrap things up, to kind of to close things out, how did reading spy fiction influence your writing this? Because I saw elsewhere you mentioned that one of your favorites is Berlin Game by Len Dayton. So I'm just curious if that had any influence on how you approach this book.
Yeah, I think it was a lot about the storytelling. You try to thread the needle a bit, right? You're a guy that's really into the genre, both fiction and nonfiction, and so I'm hoping that this is a book that you're going to read. I'm also hoping it's a book that kind of your average person that likes a good story that may not know much about the Cold War can grab onto. So there's a lot of like material in here, dates and names and hopefully history. So I wanted that in there. But the effort is like to make it a story as well, right? To have that wrapped in a narrative and a story. And so in terms of fiction, how do you structure things, create atmosphere? But I'm trying to create authentic atmosphere, right? I'm not trying to make it up. So I guess it's more in like storytelling techniques, maybe how you try to end chapters at a certain point where it's kind of a cliffhanger or whatever. Try and start the book. The sort of prologue of the book is like a real scene that happens. It's a real dialogue that actually happened that was in the files and there were actually recordings of. And, I wrote that in the present tense, for example. And that was like something that my editor was highly discouraging me from doing. But I really wanted to try and do because I thought it was first of all, I thought it was a scene that got you into the book without page one being Karel Koecher was born in 1934, you know what I mean, on line one. And then second of all, by having it in the present tense, the hope, if you do it well, the reader is there's a speed to it because the reader gets the impression that they are encountering these events in real time. That's, you try and create that sort of effect if done well. Kind of went back and through my back, catalog of books I've read or even movies or whatever. And now you don't want to recreate fictional scenes. And I guess you mentioned as well the Americans, Joe Weisberg, who created The Americans, the television show. I never saw that. I still have never watched it. And I never watched it on purpose because I was afraid. I knew what the basic plot of that show was. And this project was in development for a number of years before someone paid me to actually sit down and write the book. And so I was wary of ever watching that show, which is a show I do want to watch. It's right up my alley. But I was wary of watching that show because at some point, if I got to write the book, I was afraid I was going to suddenly subconsciously be writing scenes from the television show into my book. So I guess it was a balancing act, is I guess what I mean to say. I wanted to try and use some of the atmospherics of fiction, the storytelling techniques as best I could. It's harder to use all of those sort of techniques in a nonfiction setting, but my goal was to try and deploy some of that stuff as best I could. So it was a story. So it was history, but I don't want to say a fun read. Maybe it's a fun read, but a compelling read. A read like a film, like a movie that you kind of want to keep going, or actually in this case, maybe is a television show. I was thinking in this way is that you get to the end of chapter 2 and there's kind of something that leaves you at the end intrigued and you want to go on to chapter 3. That kind of hopefully reminds somebody of you're binge watching a TV show. It's 11 o'clock at night and you just finished an episode and you're like, well, I could watch one more. Right? It's only a 45-minute show. It's not an hour. So I'll watch one more episode, And so it's that kind of mentality that I tried to draw from the storytelling from the fiction genre, which I wouldn't consider myself a huge expert in, but it's over the decades. I'm reading a couple books in the genre a year. Detective stuff I like too, and that's kind of a similar storytelling techniques, characters and stuff, character development and stuff like that. So it was always sort of present in my mind for sure.
Well, and I would call it fun. I thought it was a fun read, and good. I enjoyed it. It gave a good sense of the wider Cold War as well, which I appreciated, and it had a different perspective versus normally you're seeing KGB versus the CIA. This had a slightly different angle to it that I appreciated. I enjoyed it and encourage folks to check it out.
Well, thank you for saying that. When someone says that, it's kind of what I was hoping to do, and if it got through to you, that feels good. So thank you for saying that.
Ben, if folks want to keep up with what you're up to and find the book and all of that, what's the best way for them to do that?
So, I have my own website, sort of in the process of a revamp, but, my background's there, and there's, sort of links and more stuff about the book. So my name is Benjamin Cunningham. So it's bcunningham.org. I'm on Twitter @Cunning_tweets, @CunningTweets, but an underline in between. You can purchase the book, obviously, wherever you want, your usual online booksellers and stuff, but my parents live in the suburbs of Detroit, so my mom was taking pictures at the local Barnes & Noble there and stuff of it on the shelf when it was out there, proud. And she was telling the teenager working at the cash register that I wrote the book, and he was not that impressed, but my mom was excited about it. So no, yeah, there's, you can find it everywhere, and we're hopeful. We had some real brief discussions at this point, but sort of ongoing with film and TV people. So there's a chance this might be turned into something else. I know there's a couple other language. We already have an agreement with publishers in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It's being translated into those languages, which was a really good thing for me, kind of validating that, the native languages actually found the book credible enough to want to translate it into their language. That felt good. And I know my agent last week was the Frankfurt Book Fair, which is the big sort of international book fair. And he was talking to a bunch of people about other language versions or whatever. So hopefully you'll be bombarded with all sorts of propaganda, whether you want to or not. But yeah, my website, my Twitter account, all kinds of news there. And books should be pretty much available anywhere you like to get your books.
That's great. Well, I'll have links to all of that in the show notes, so if you're interested, you can find that all there. Ben, thanks again for joining me. I really appreciated talking to you.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. It was really great to talk with you, and keep up the good work.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode. If you have any suggestions for future things that we should cover, drop a comment on the Spybrary Facebook group, or you can hit me directly with Twitter @Spyright. And if you enjoy the show, I would just ask if you listening right now, please consider taking 2 seconds to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. We'll have links to everything discussed in the podcast show notes. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.